Hi, welcome to Quiet Before. I'm Nancy Bulalakaw. I'm excited to be here with Asian American Feminist Collective co-founders, Senti and Julie. Today, we're going to talk about the collective's origin story and a little bit of what led to the collective and the work that they engage in up till now. Senti, do you want to start? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Nancy, so much for having us. This is a big deal. I've reviewed some of your previous interviews, and you have spoken to some real superstars of our movement. So we're really honored that you have chosen us to chat with today. My name is Senti Sojwal. My pronouns are she, her. I work in the reproductive health and rights movement, and I'm a co-founder of AAFC based in Brooklyn.
I'm Julie, she, her pronouns. Similar to Senti, I was actually thinking about like the archive and how important it is to kind of write down our stories and like have it as a resource, because I've been doing some archival research into like feminist collectives in the 70s and 80s recently. So this was kind of like a really cool thing to do as I'm trying to research other Asian American feminist collectives. I'm currently in Columbus, Ohio, doing my MFA in creative nonfiction, but my prior life was working in city government and organizing in New York City.
Julie was part of the live stream series that launched Quiet Before, which was about, I think, 2 years ago. That series was really conceived and created and produced in response to the Atlanta spa murders. As we know, that time had a real surge in anti-Asian violence, but those particular murders, a lot of things were born out of that little period because of our pain around it and trying to process where our community stands in light of all that hate. I remember, Julie, in conversation with you, how your collective was being asked a lot to speak to where the community was at, how it was feeling. I think a lot of you were being asked to represent the community. What stood out for me in our conversation was how responsible and thoughtful you were. You were thinking about what came before. Why I wanted to do Quiet Before was because I was on, what was that app around that time? Clubhouse. And I was listening to people who had never connected to the community in the past speak as if they understood Asian American history. And so I've always been very moved and impressed by your thoughtfulness and intentionality around being a representative and knowing what came before. I know the collective began in 2017. Can you both sort of go back to prior to 2017 and talk a little bit about how you met, how you came together, and what helped to bring the collective together?
Before we officially launched as a collective, 2017, we were more of like a loose network of a lot of different Asian American scholars, artists, historians, activists. And then we realized that we would like to kind of have more structure as we start to think through some of the ideas of Asian American feminism and those intersections. And so we officially launched as a collective in 2018. Prior to that, I actually wasn't a super politically active college student. I'm teaching for the first time, like college freshmen. And I feel like a lot of younger, like college students are very aware of kind of the state of the world and like have a political perspective. But I really did it until I actually started my job at the mayor's office of immigrant affairs. Like that was my job at the time, like around 2016. It was around, all the rhetoric and kind of fear that was happening around Trump potentially getting elected, and then having the Women's March there at that time, and really like a collective voice, like a feminist voice raising up at that time, and noticing and realizing like what is like the Asian American perspective on some of the feminist conversations that are happening around the election. It really just started off with having a workshop on Asian American feminism in the kind of rise of Trump. And it was a workshop, the very first gathering that we did, because of the fact that I personally did not feel confident or really know what Asian American feminism is or what it meant. And I wanted to have those conversations conversations with people who are interested in exploring that?
I met Julie actually at that first conversation of Asian American feminism in the age of Trump. At that time, I was working at Sakhi for South Asian Women, which is an anti-violence organization that supports immigrant survivors of domestic violence in New York City. It's interesting looking back on that time because it feels so far away in so many ways. You know, Julie and I grew up and became more politically conscious, I think, in a time where it felt like there was, at least on the surface level, like a lot of progress, you know, like the first elections we voted in was Barack Obama. Like it felt like there was so much positive momentum when we were kids and getting older around that time, high school, college. It was really jarring, scary, wild time in the year leading up to the election. I worked obviously at a South Asian women's organization. So I was really deeply involved in community work in my own community with my own people. I'm Indian American. I had never even heard the term Asian American feminism before. In New York, we're very lucky to have a wealth of resources for various immigrant communities. They're oftentimes very siloed. So there might be like an organization that specifically creates support and services for Korean community members, for example. Even though I was very entrenched in that world through my work, I had not really been part of very many Pan-Asian conversations that were grounded in a political analysis of solidarity in that way. And one thing that I think is important about what we do and the conversations we try to create is that we in no way see ourselves as an authority on what Asian America is, who our people even are, how people identify, or even necessarily the meaning of Asian American feminism. I think the point is that we really want to have a conversation and invite people into our movement so we can address some of these big questions together. That's what I think was so powerful about that first workshop, was that it really was just a conversation. It was, to me, like so reminiscent of so many things I have read about in terms of consciousness raising feminist groups of the 60s and 70s. So many social movements just begin with people gathered together around kitchen tables and living rooms at community centers. We have always really understood, I think, that a conversation is like the first part of a political momentum of building solidarity, of just inviting people in and talking about some of these big, complicated, hard things with a lot of compassion and openness. I think it really just began there. I don't think we had ever really thought at that initial stage when we began having these conversations with community that it would become something more formalized. And I think what came out of those initial first conversations was just seeing so much that there was a really deep hunger for these conversations. So many people, myself included, I think Julie too, and other members who would eventually become part of the leadership of our collective were like, I've actually never been in a physical space before with people talking about Asian American feminism, what that means. This came at a time where, like Julie mentioned, we were seeing a sort of rise in visibility of more mainstream feminist politics that felt like it was very much led by, you know, liberal white women. That was like pussy hats. And that was so much of what we were seeing as like the feminist uprising against Trump. Obviously, there are parts of that that were hugely important. Like the Women's March was important. I don't think any of us would deny that. What we also saw was the invisibilization of people who looked like us, of immigrant communities, of queer folks. It felt like there just wasn't so much of an intersectional analysis around the feminism that was becoming more visible around Trump. And it felt very grounded in like a neoliberal white way of conceiving of feminism and liberation. So I think we all had been sort of tangentially part of some of those conversations and had all realized when we came together, like there is something missing here. This conversation is not speaking to us. I think it was Shirley Chisholm who said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, like you pull up a chair and you create your own. So I really think of what we did at that time, like as that we didn't see ourselves reflected in a very public conversation about feminism. So we decided to create our own conversation and create our own seat at the table.
Thank you for that. To that first workshop, how was that organized? Who hosted it? Where was it? Do you remember those details?
I was actually a part of the leadership committee with the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, so NAPAWF, New York City chapter. I did a lot of the initial organizing with the NAPAWF steering committee at that time. At the same time, there were kind of long-standing Asian American feminists who supported the endeavor. So for example, like Reappropriate, she's a blogger, but she's been blogging about like feminism in Asian America for a really long time and kind of was like the premier voice that spoke about some of that. And she was really generous actually in agreeing to come to the workshop and help facilitate, just because Jen Fang wanted to be a part of the conversation that was happening and felt it was important to be there. I still am very grateful to Jen for deciding to do that, because it wasn't like we were some long-standing organization or anything. We were just people who were like, hey, Jen, we want to do this. Can you come and help us? And she came and helped facilitate some of those conversations. We had the event at NYU. We just had a big room and we divided up into groups. Like after like kind of a short presentation, we split off into groups and just started conversing about what, the topic was. So that was the first event.
Did you connect with NAPAWF through your work at the mayor's office?
No, that was separate. I just, I think I really did crave a space of organizing that was focused on Asian Americans and women. Even before AAFC, I had questions about my own identity and just like how do we fit into larger conversations around activism and wanting to be connected to that. So I was part of the steering committee for I think 2 years. AFC kind of was going on its own direction. Like NAPAWF has its own like priorities. And so I think with AFC, we decided to kind of branch off into our own collective so that we can focus more on this question on what is Asian American feminism.
The time that you're describing is a unique time to be asking these kinds of questions prior to Trump's first term. How did Trump actually getting elected contribute to how AFC coalesced into something more formal?
Before he had even been elected, there was such a huge impact culturally and socially. For example, having big national conversations around things like sexual assault and violence. We all remember Grab Them by the Pussy, working at a gender-based violence organization. I think I was just so attuned to the violence and misogyny of what I was seeing from him at that time. Obviously, that's always exist, especially in politics, especially from men in power. But I think to see those things so overtly and not covertly in other ways that violence is often enacted on our communities in terms of like the types of speech that's used, just how jarring that was. And then I think it was sort of a buildup of just seeing that increase and increase. It only made him and his movement more powerful and strong. And there were obviously no repercussions. What resulted was even greater political divisions in our country that were now sort of legitimized, like the hateful way and misogynistic way and racist way that he was speaking was now sort of politically legitimized in a different way, I think, than maybe it had been before. So I think that when he was elected, I do think that that sort of lit a fire under our asses, so to speak. It was sort of like, okay, like now this is really happening and it's here, and we are entering a space of a different political playbook than one we have experienced before. It wasn't like that long ago, but I feel so much older than I was at that time. I think it lit within all of us just like a deep, deep urgency that was really built on the urgency that I think had been felt in so many of those community conversations. I think we held a couple of those, Julie, like some of those just conversational type, open to anybody who wanted to come. We had like a panel around that time, I remember, that was with some Asian American leaders of different social justice and service organizations in New York, gathering leaders to sort of talk about what the potential election of Trump could mean and sort of like different political questions that were arising at that time. It felt like at every event, it was like more and more people. It felt like it was sort of growing even without us frankly doing that much other than being like, we're going to hold these conversations. And I think we did end up formalizing because of just the huge momentum we were seeing. And we ended up identifying a few members who had been a part of some of those initial conversations, Julie and I included, who decided that we would take on the actual like leadership and launching as a formal collective so that we could do more of these events and do more of this political education with like a slightly more formalized structure.
Senti, I wanted to go back a little bit because your experience is a little different from Julie's in working with Saki, which I have known about for decades, but I'm not sure of the structure. I would imagine that there's probably a lot of opportunity for mentoring within the organization and probably a sense of continuation and a passing on of history. So can you speak to your experience prior to that first workshop, how you thought of organizing and how you thought of your place in history and in the community?
Working at Saki was one of the most formative and important experiences of my life. So many of my friends and sisters from Saki continue to be hugely important parts of my life. My former boss at Saki, Shalini, is still someone I consider a very close friend and mentor today. So I think that really had a big impact on how I thought about AAFC and sort of passing the baton. Being able to be a part of a South Asian feminist community that was really built on a legacy of really radical politics. Saki was founded in the early 90s. And one thing that I think is so amazing about them is that they, would take very public actions against abusers. They would do things like stand in front of an abuser's house and they would like make it known in the neighborhood that this person was like abusing their wife and children. And so much of what they did was hugely impactful in bringing the in the shadows conversation of domestic violence, particularly in Asian or immigrant communities, into the forefront and making this this is a community problem that should be solved using community tools and breaking the silence around violence that happens within our home, particularly patriarchal violence. Sharing that publicly is a huge part of how we're able to achieve justice for people who experience violence. I did gender studies in college. I went to like a very lefty hippie school and did a feminist ethnographic project about South Asian feminism for my senior thesis. I did a lot of research on Saki, and I think even interviewed some of the people who were working there at that time. And then after I graduated from college, I moved to Asia for a little bit and then came back. And the first job opening that I saw when I was starting my job hunt was at Saki. I worked there for almost 3 years. I don't know, it really felt like the universe, like I was meant to be there and I was meant to meet those women who really changed my life. I think I just felt so much power and also a deep sense of home and community getting to be a part of that. And I think that was something I had really felt to be lacking in my life up until that point. Being able to explore and share publicly our feminist history of Asian and Asian American feminism. There is a deeply rooted history of that within the diaspora and our communities. But when I was a young person becoming more politically conscious and even studying feminism, I didn't see people who looked like me or really understand that there was a legacy of feminist organizing in India or even here. That just was not history that was readily available to me until I really actively sought that out. And then I was able to see for myself, women and people of my community have been not just doing the shit for like hundreds of years, but like actively leading movements and changing lives and changing laws and having a deep, powerful impact on culture through like understanding more of that history and then getting to work somewhere where I felt like I really saw a lot of those politics in action taught me that something like AAFC was possible. We do have an opportunity here and we have so much interest. Clearly, people are hungry for this and we are by no means the first people to do this whatsoever. But the fact of the matter is, like, if you asked an Asian teenage girl in the early 2000s, if she had even known that people who looked like her had been leading feminist movements for hundreds of years, she wouldn't know that. So I think that that's what we see as like a huge part of what we have to do now. And there was definitely a deep relationship between my work at Saki and then eventually becoming part of AAFC.
Thank you. When you were talking about a teenage girl, it brought up this thing for me. I don't know exactly when this happened. When I was a teenager, I was in B. Dalton. I picked up Jessica Hagedorn's book of poetry. You know, I saw that she was Filipino. I read this one poem by her. She references like a shooting star, and my last name means shooting star. Prior to that, I had never seen or heard of a Filipino American who had that kind of platform, who created that kind of art. And just finding that in a B. Dalton, in the mall that I was a teenager in, how powerful that is and how lonely it can be not having those kinds of role models. I've worked in the community my whole life, and to know and hear or see about young people who don't have a connection to our history surprises me and worries me. It's why Quiet Before exists. It's not to make money. It's not to have huge audiences. It's the idea that maybe someday a young person will be searching how something started, and that this is a chance for them to actually hear from the people who are making that history, and that there isn't this question about like fact or truth, because they'll be able to hear it from you. Thank you for that. I love Saki. You know, it makes sense that your meeting would create something that has gone on to last and be powerful. Can you talk about the formalization of the collective and the other members and some of the programs that you did early on? And also, you're talking about some of this being in reaction to like the Women's March and the politics around that. But if you can also talk about how your collective works with other communities, allies, and your thinking around that and what the work has been around that as well.
I think in terms of actually formalizing, after doing about almost 6 months to a year of decentralized organizing, like more whoever's available, like kind of different people coming in and out of doing different events, because we've done events on like history of, you know, feminist Asian America, where we brought in like historians. We also did like a mental health and Asian American feminism intersection. We've also done like politics, so inviting political representatives also. And so I feel like we were kind of really trying to cover a lot of different areas and topics. After about like 6 months to a year of that, we realized that doing an event a month was really unsustainable. And also trying to organize such a large group of people where this is just like, you know, on a one-off basis was extremely difficult. And so the founding leadership was Rachel, Kuo, Senti, and myself, and Tiffany. So the four of us would meet up at Rachel's apartment in Crown Heights. One of our first projects was working on an Asian American feminist manifesto, kind of thinking about like the Combahee River Collective and their like manifesto, and kind of desiring like maybe like an Asian American version of what is Asian American feminism to us. Also realizing that events were awesome and really great at giving us kind of that energy and seeing people in person. But in terms of longevity and dissemination of our ideas and things we've discussed, we've realized that writing things down, having a website, creating zines about some of our topics was another way to reach a larger audience and reach people who might not be in New York, and like be able to share our information that way, as well as have conversations. So I feel like that's what led to our actual formalization, just trying to have like a structure and trying to have a more consistent group of people committed to this project. I think some of our biggest things have definitely been our zines. We did like a feminist history zine. We've done one during COVID. We also did the very first one, which was just kind of like making of Asian American feminism, and we disseminated those. And then in terms of like key collaborators, in the very beginning, we worked a lot with like the Bangladeshi Feminist Collective, who were active in New York at that time. And those are some of my really close friends at that time as well. One of my friends, Taitun, was part of the Bangladeshi Feminist Collective. And there's a long history of feminist organizing in Bangladesh. And so it was really cool to like connect on that. And she worked with me. So that was really cool too. Like, I think the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, in my opinion, my best job ever, was just being able to like meet like-minded people. And so collaborating with them on like what has happened and what kind of work that they're doing in their immigrant communities in New York City and in the diaspora. And then also with, Red Canary song, which they weren't Red Canary, I guess, back then, but basically I remember one of the organizers, Kai, was organizing a vigil for Yang Song in Flushing. They asked us to come and speak, and that seemed like a very feminist issue, and wanted to be there for sure at that time. This was before conversations around Asian American women, sex work, and immigration was even happening much at that time. So that was definitely also like a key moment, I would say, in terms of like how do we practice Asian American feminism in the real world.
In terms of our collaborations and some of the work we've done, I think that collaborating with artists, many different kinds of artists, from writers who do creative work to folks who write essays to visual artists and poets, has been a really critical part of the work that we do. It feels important for us, I think, to actualize that we cannot come to grand political conclusions about our experiences and our identities without first really exploring and sharing them. I think that has been a really important part of what we do. So a lot of our zines feature collaborations with artists who, are sometimes our friends. Sometimes we put out a call for collaborators on different types of work that we do. We also had a story series that's now published on our website called First Times. That was one where we put out a call for submissions for Asian Americans to submit to us their stories of first times doing anything. So there are stories about like first times having a specific type of conversation with someone's mother, or like the first time someone had sex, or the first time someone saw themselves represented in media. To me, that feels like a really critical part of the work we do that is really in relationship to things like a more formal, for example, workshop at a university about the history of Asian American feminism. One thing that we feel is really important about our structure is that it is not super formal. There are 4 of us in leadership now. We brought on a close friend of ours, Dr. Saloni Bauman, who studies history and is also South Asian. So there's 4 of us now, including Rachel. We have never become established, for example, as like a 501c3. We've never had a board. We really want this to not feel like our jobs. That feels like a really important part of our structure together. We always say that we are friends first, and our collaboration, our work together, is really deeply rooted in our love for one another as people, as feminists. We have really resisted going the more formal route that sometimes political organizations can take, because we want this to always feel like a project that is one, like by choice, where we can also have more consensus-based decision making, where we are not beholden to anyone other than ourselves and our communities. That feels like a really important part of our structure that, isn't necessarily laid out in the manifesto or anything, but feels like a way to live out our politics in a way that feels really authentic to us. That I think is something kind of unique and feels really important to like our integrity of how we hold our relationships to one another as friends first, and like coworkers second. We would never talk about ourselves that way. I don't think that's how we feel about one another. And I think that's part of what keeps this project sustainable, and part of what fuels it too, in terms of also how we do some of like the governing of how we carry out this work and also build our relationships. For example, our co-leader, Rachel, is currently pregnant, and we allow space for people to take breaks and do whatever they need to do to make sure that they like are healthy and can then return to the work in a way that feels like really life-giving and sustaining. We also give a lot of leeway for one another to like take on and create projects as they want to. The four of us come from really different backgrounds in terms of our work. So I work in the repro health space. Julie comes from politics and is also a creative writer. Rachel is a professor who writes about and studies media and culture and does a lot of work around digital activism, and particularly its intersections with Asian American organizing. And Saloni studied history and does a lot of work and thinking around like care work and the AIDS crisis. And I really love how different all of our backgrounds are, but also how that gives us the leeway to be individuals in this work together and bring our own unique perspectives and our relationships to what we do. I think it's a real process that's like grounded in so much breathing room and grace for one another. And I think that really came to a head sort of through COVID and like seeing how much our work had to change, and also the urgency around responding to this national conversation about anti-Asian violence. And it felt like so many people kind of in certain ways like media, but also people we knew of like, what is the political analysis of this moment? And I think us feeling a lot of pressure to provide that while we were living it, and also living in so much fear and scarcity and violence. In that period, we gave ourselves so much grace to be able to experience that together and offer support readily. And then when we felt like we had the space and the room and like the heart to do it, to be able to come together and think more analytically, like, how can we talk about this moment in a politically conscious way? How can we ground it in history? Obviously, there's a longstanding history of anti-Asian violence in this country, but many people don't know that. I'm really proud of how we navigated COVID together as a collective. And I think it provided us a sort of reset in terms of how we thought about like the future of our organization and how we wanted to be sustainable, was by giving ourselves a lot of space and grace to take care of ourselves and each other.
When I met Julie for the first time, Jamie was also on the panel with you. The collective and Jamie had just embarked on a collaboration, which was facilitated by the surge in anti-Asian violence.
We started the Black and Asian Feminist Solidarities Project. It's a column that lives at the Asian American Writers Workshop magazine, The Margins. That collaboration is still going on. We actually chose to publish 12 pieces, so it'll be coming out monthly through the end of the year. That was like an unexpected collaboration that also felt really meaningful, especially during like times of COVID, when Black and Asian communities were being pitted against each other, and also in a way like standing in the tradition of women of color feminisms, because a lot of their work in the past has actually been about bridging that, bringing solidarities in, like with Kitchen Table Press and, you know, this Bridge Call My Back, which I feel like has really resurged as well. I feel like that project felt like we were following in that tradition.
And how did that come to be?
It actually just came through Instagram. Like, you know, Jamie reached out being like, hey, I'd love to do like an IG live with you all about basically the COVID crisis and how it's affecting our communities in different ways. With Asians, it's very like the anti-Asian rhetoric, which kind of spurred on like anti-Asian violence. There was the Black Lives Matter movement happening at that time, at the start of COVID, like in 2020. And so there was just a lot of huge conversations that needed to happen. After that first IG Live, it ended up becoming part of a longer project with Asian American Writers Workshop, where we got to kind of sit with the question a bit more, and also bringing in other people to share their thoughts on this idea of Black and Asian feminist solidarities.
I think to talk about where we are now and the 2024 election coming up and all of the things that are resurfacing along with Trump and the political drama, how has that impacted your thinking and your feeling? And do you have a relationship to this trajectory, as it was what helped to start the group? Is that starting a new conversation and your thinking around your political lives?
I am not really thinking that much about it. Something that the past few years of our work has really taught me and enlivened in me is like the power of being involved in local politics and organizing. So much of the work that we've done the past few years, like the coalitions we've been a part of, the relationships we've built, are local ones here in New York City. And I think that's where we really feel like the most relationship to power and change, and also our own communities here on the ground. I think particularly during COVID, seeing that surge of anti-Asian violence, so much of which was enacted upon Asian women, and then turning to community partners and actually having conversations about community safety and what that looked like, because so much of the response we were seeing from the state were, really carceral responses that were about like, oh, let's expand police forces and let's create an Asian task force of cops in New York City. That prompted us to have really big conversations with our partners in our community about what safety actually meant to us. That doesn't mean more police. Police have targeted our people and will continue to, more so than really thinking about the national landscape. I think our work is really focused on what we can do here at home, and also how these seemingly small things of starting a conversation, inviting people into your home or to a space to be able to just spark that first kernel of like, what is this moment that we're living in, and what do you see, and what is your family saying, and what are you experiencing? Where do you feel safe and unsafe, and what does that mean? Where do you feel lit up? How can the resources we have be expanded, and what should we actually be? Because we should be dictating how the state protects us, more so than thinking too much about 24 and the national political landscape. I really feel a desire to do as much as I can here in the place where I live with the communities that I see marginalized, and think about where I can actually have an impact. That feels more fruitful to me.
I also think that through COVID, especially like 2020, 2021, realizing our perspective as Asian American feminists and like having an Asian American and feminist analysis on things that are happening is going to be an important perspective that we want to cultivate. One of the things that we're working on is like an Asian American, like feminist perspective on like the anti-Asian violence. I feel like a lot of the times in feminist conversations, like the Asian American part might not be really talked about at all, whereas like in maybe Asian American organizing spaces, the feminist perspective isn't talked about as much. So I think that is like an intersection that we hope that we can provide more perspective on as things come up.
So you described your core leadership. Is there a larger group that regularly meets? How do you interact with other feminists? And do you plan projects for kind of a larger contribution?
I think a lot of our projects have been more contributors. So for example, we did a collaboration with Kundimon on like an Asian American feminist writing workshop where we had 20 writers. We worked with them for 6 or 8 weeks. And that was like a forum where we were able to like have conversations and produce like a zine at the end. I feel like we're working on more writing projects as like our way to share our work. But like our column right now is also another way we've been working with contributors. But in terms of like actually meeting with other groups, as of now, not as much. I think during COVID, there were groups meeting to like talk more about our response to the anti-Asian violence that was happening. And I think that in the last few years, because of the advent of COVID, I think we've also had to pivot a lot in terms of how do we make this work sustainable for us. And we've been doing more internal work of like making our structure better, like our processes better, like how are we planning our projects, like so we've had to do some of that in the last year or so.
So many of the relationships that we've built have happened really organically. I think especially, we're a little bit more spread out now amongst the four of us, but in the beginning when we all were here in New York, we really utilized a lot of the connections that we already had, and then sort of use those to continue to build momentum. For example, working at Saki, I was very entrenched in South Asian organizing. And then also through my work, like had a lot of relationships with other Asian organizations in New York that were either like service-oriented organizations, political organizations, or even, folks who were in office. We used a lot of those relationships, and a lot of the people that we work with, have really become friends. And a lot of the coalitions we've been a part of have come out of knowing people in our corner. I think something that also feels important in terms of how we think about our own like growth or reach. I'm very much of like the Adrienne Marie Brown school of like how we measure progress. She talks a lot about how we think that progress or like visibility has to be like so big, and like that's how we think about moving forward, of just like more and more people seeing us or knowing about us, as opposed to like actually doing the more gentle work of being in community and building solidarity, which often happens behind closed doors and is not glamorous, but is actually how you make movements more sustainable and like life-giving and lifelong. I think like for us, some of those goalposts of more like mainstream organizations, some of which we currently or have in the past worked at even or know very intimately, I don't think that we measure progress that way. I think like we measure progress by like the quality and connection of our relationships and coalitions, and of like what we're able to provide for people, whether that's like a space to just talk, or if that is a moment of political education. I think that feels really important to me and how I think about like our longevity and our future, really resisting some of these capitalist modes of thinking about our value as an organization by not how much we've grown, but more like the actual quality of the work that we're producing and the relationships that we're building.
Senti, when you were talking about Rachel being pregnant and being mindful of what you each have going on and what your capacity is, and helping to facilitate like healthiness in your individual lives in order to facilitate a healthy connection to each other, I love that. It makes more sense than, as you're saying, how groups form and what the expectations are and pressures. But because you have very busy individual lives, what would you say allows the four of you to stay connected and committed to each other in a way that helps you keep moving forward in the way that you want to be?
We meet once a month. So we used to meet in person and now we meet over Zoom. And because we are spread out, we also are very intentional to schedule at least one retreat per year where we can actually all physically be together. This year, we ventured to the Midwest and did a really beautiful few days on the lake in Michigan. That coming together time in person is hugely important. We really are friends. A lot of like being able to share about capacity or things that are going on in our personal lives, it's not hard to share that. Like it feels very organic. It's really not like work, which again, like that's by design. We took a pause once when COVID was really super present. Like I think we took off a summer so we could really prioritize some of our rest and healing. I think something that feels really important is like we measure the success of our organization, the work that we're doing, also by the happiness of the four of us. Are you happy to be doing this? Is this like a choice you are happy to continue making every day? If that's not the case, like what can be changed to make sure that you continue to enter this space in a way that feels like loving and good for you? I think that's like actually a really important part of how we live out our politics as well, not by force. We really want this to feel like the inverse of your job.
Working in a collective or any group really has challenges, conflicts. I've been interested in kind of seeing what other feminist collectives might have done. And one of the things I found is a lot of them do disband pretty quickly. That is something that I'm reflecting on too, of like, we have been working together for 7 years now, and I think there were a lot of ups and downs. A really big important part of it is we don't know the answers. So a lot of our work is also just like, this is my thoughts on this that could be controversial. I don't know if this is right. Like, this is my thoughts, but what do you all think? And being able to like constructively and lovingly be able to like converse about really difficult, complicated topics is a big part of that too. Because we're not going to know the answer or like do something that's really meaningful without having those like tough conversations that help us to get there.
Also, just to share some of the brass tacks of what that means too, is that we have invested a lot, I think, in our longevity and our relationship building. So we have hired external facilitators to join us on retreats, to help lead that. The retreats and a lot of our ongoing conversations, like monthly conversations, have built in time and space to actually share things like hurt feelings or differences of opinion, or provide some structure for how to share things like, okay, when I am in a bad place, like I notice in myself, this is how that manifests for me. And this might be some of the energy that I'm bringing to our collective space when I'm feeling off because of X, Y, and Z. It's a project of very deep vulnerability. It's often uncomfortable, and I think it should be. But as Julie said, it's really not easy. I don't want to pretend that it is, but also I think when you invest in that and you like accept that the difficulty is part of it and also part of what makes it good, I think that's something that has proven to be really valuable for us. I think we can be kind of conflict avoidant, those of us in leadership, and we have had some real ups and downs, and actually realizing like the avoidance just creates more of the problem, and having conversations amongst ourselves of like, how can we lovingly create space to share hard things and hurt feelings in ways that are going to move us forward? So I would definitely say there's been a fair amount of like almost like group therapy type work that we have been in together. And I also want to say that along with sharing some of the difficulties, something that also we do that I feel like is absent from like mainstream work culture is like being able to also share deep appreciation and like naming publicly and sharing the value that we see in one another. Taking turns to, for example, say like, here are the things, Julie, that I have noticed that you have been doing so spectacularly, like parts of our work that you've been leading, relationships you've been building. I admire that and I thank you for it. And so I think like we take real care to like build in both of those things, making sure that the space for appreciation and love is there. And also that makes the hard conversations possible because we have tried to build a real foundation of trust and care.
Thank you for sharing that. It makes a lot of sense that you've been able to continue working together for 7 years. It's not easy. And I think the points about being vulnerable and appreciating each other and not being conflict avoidant are probably like the 3 most important things that you have committed to as a group. And I think it's super healthy and everybody should model themselves after that. Julie, you were talking about your research. Can you go a little more into that research and what you all have learned about feminist collectives that have come before, or even Asian American women that are inspiring to you, individuals or collectives, or something that is meaningful that you think has been an influence in how you do this work?
Right now, I'm focused on researching the members of the Unbound Feet Collective. I first heard of members of the Unbound Feet Collective really at the start of my kind of feminist consciousness because of the book This Bridge Called My Back. And that was the first book where I actually saw Asian American feminists talking about Asian American feminism, solidarities, women of color feminisms, and just like their own experiences and how they experience sexism, patriarchy in the world, especially from like an Asian American perspective and a queer perspective. So I've already been like super interested in like these people's lives, and it's not even that long ago, like it's like 70s, 80s, 90s, and I'm also just like really inspired by how they built multiracial coalition. The publishing world back then was also so much harder, and so like a lot of their work was only published by independent presses or like presses that they made themselves, right? Like the Kitchen Table Press. I want to do some archival research on some of these women. So like Nellie Wong, Kitty Sway, Mitsue Yamada, like Willis Kim, basically their work that's been out that also isn't like super widely available, like even though they've been published. Even like Willis Kim was the first queer Asian American writer who like published something or like is seen as. And I couldn't find their work. I have access to a university library. And so I was able to like try to get copies of it. I think it's just like realizing that a lot of our history, especially like queer Asian American feminist history, is really hard to access. And that's part of the reason why it's so hard to like see ourselves like reflected in some of like the conversations around feminism, because we feel like, oh, that's not just a part of our history, that's not a part of what Asian American activism is. I'm kind of just starting it right now. I'm like trying to go to the archives in the summer, hopefully. I just was reading The Yellow Woman Speaks by Merle Wu. I just got like her, oh, you can't really see it, but like it's just some of her writings like from the 1970s. I just feel like it's so cool to read that. I won't be able to read that unless I find it out on my own. And I would love for it to be more widely accessible, maybe through AAFC, like just giving people like lists, like more access. Like we've done reading lists before. We've done like art history. I actually did Unbound Feet Collective for the zine as well, just like an overview of them. I'm just curious to like make our history more available, especially like Asian American feminist history.
One of the first workshops that we developed together as a collective is about Asian American feminist history in action. This really draws on the themes that Julie was just discussing. It involved all of us, the leadership, like sharing some of the Asian and Asian American feminist organizers of the past and how we have drawn on them, learned from them, and how like our work is really built on their legacy. It feels really important, I think, also for young people. Oftentimes we have had people at our workshops and events who are super young. And I think like, just like we're not able to be made aware of so much of this history because it's not what we're taught in school. Some of the workshop touches on some like really well-known Asian American activists, like Yuri Kochiyama or Grace Lee Boggs, people that some people in school might have heard of, to like some more little known movements and activists. And as part of the workshop, also, I spoke to the history of Saki, which very similar to us, really began with like 5 friends who wanted to do something about the gender-based violence in their communities in New York City and wanted to do it in a really culturally resonant way that understood how South Asian immigrants and women operated and gathered and how they could reach them. I think we want to share through those workshops that our history is really long and it's also very alive today, and also to push back against a lot of the myths that so many of us have in some ways really internalized, I think, about Asian American women in particular, that we are like quiet or docile or we're exotic or hypersexual and like sexually available, particularly to white men. And so how have our people like really resisted a lot of these dominant conceptions over time? And also how did these conceptions come to exist? So many of them are legacies of colonialism. It is our job to really put that in context today and to share the many different ways that women and feminists who share our heritage have pushed back against these narratives for many, many generations.
I think it's so inspiring that this next election is coming up, and to consider where you all are at now, Senti, when you said that your focus and the group's focus is more local and recognizing the power you have locally. It's really wonderful to witness that something that started from fear and uncertainty has brought you here at the dawn of a new scary time. How do you feel your work or the work that you want to do speaks to where we are in a local way? Feeling more empowered locally, do you feel more empowered in general? What is your state of mind considering those different aspects?
During COVID, something that we put together, much of this led by our co-founder, Rachel, was an open letter about wanting cop-free communities in response to the state response of wanting to increase police presence in Asian American neighborhoods in New York City, and also to create like an Asian police task force to combat the violence. Rachel really led the writing of this open letter that was basically illustrating the harms that police were enacting on our communities today and historically, really illustrating that our communities have been targeted by police, people from massage parlor workers in Queens to like street vendors all over New York City, to taxi drivers who are being continually fucked over by the state. There are so many ways in which police directly target Asian immigrant communities in New York City. How can we possibly expect that a solution to community safety comes within this body that enacts so much violence today and historically upon our people? That open letter was circulated during the pandemic and was signed by a lot of other orgs in New York, like Napof, Mekong, the Chinese Feminist Collective, Red Canary Song, Wow Project, and a bunch of other orgs that we have been in coalition with for a long time. I think that we really want to continue in that work, moving forward of like being able to present and work through abolitionist politics as they relate to our communities and our people specifically. There's also, as we can see now in New York City, there is an ongoing and really ballooning migrant crisis. There are thousands of migrants coming a week to New York City, and they are remaining unhoused without resources. Eric Adams is not really doing anything to help these people. I think that we really are thinking through and wanting to be a part of conversations about how do we locate our politics and our analysis to things that are happening here today in the places where we live. There are so many issues right now that are happening, maybe tangentially related to the election, but definitely related to the future of our city and our communities that we really want to be a part of and provide that analysis on. I think like that's something that we really see as part of what we can do is like help shape how people can think about this and also put like a historical framework on a lot of the conversations that are happening today, because so many of these are really deeply related to, once again, like histories of colonialism and oppression and misogyny that our people have gone through many times before. So often, especially like in this conversation, I'm realizing just so much of the work that we do and the analysis that we work to articulate really comes from history, being students of history, and thinking about how we can apply that to what's happening today to help shape how people can think about current events.
I feel like there's just so much going on and so much that is on top of mind. All the Supreme Court decisions, like affirmative action being repealed. I'm seeing the real repercussions of that just as a grad student, because my university is saying that they're not going to be able to potentially give the fellowship they gave me, which was like a diversity fellowship, to students coming in. Like there are direct repercussions that I'm feeling on things like that, where Asian Americans are kind of being utilized in that conversation. And then also just like the environment, even though that we are focused on like Asian American feminisms, for me, it's like, how can we utilize our perspective for like real changes, real crises on the environment and climate change, and making sure that we're having our community's perspectives and like our perspectives in thinking about some of these really, really global issues of like consumption. I asked my class, how do you feel about the state of the world? I was curious like to see how young people feel about the world, and they were all like saying that they're feeling very scared and anxious, And I think that there's a lot of agitation and there's a lot of opportunities to mobilize, which is like a part of thinking about like what are the issues that we can work on as Asian American feminists. The analysis, the framework is important to like all the different things that are happening. The climate, for example, that really is like something that's at the top of my mind, at least right now.
I think one thing too that feels really important that we've done in the past and feels like a big part of our future too is like illuminating how a lot of these national conversations continually leave out Asian Americans and Asian immigrants. So there's very little national data. Asian Americans and Asian immigrants in the US are really highly under researched. There isn't a lot of funding put into actually researching our communities and our people and our struggles. And that's a huge problem. Just speaking from working in the reproductive health movement, obviously Roe was overturned recently, but far before then, abortion and reproductive health care in general was becoming more and more inaccessible to all kinds of marginalized communities, Asian immigrants among them. We are so often left out of the conversation on abortion rights and access, despite the fact that a huge swath of Asian immigrants in the US live in poverty, struggle with healthcare access from a whole host of issues, whether that's related to financial access or language ability. So there might be resources that exist, but if they aren't distributed in languages that people speak and understand, it's almost as if the resource doesn't exist. There's just so much work we have to do, I think, to be able to illustrate and locate like our people and our communities within these large scale conversations about things like workers' rights, abortion rights, climate justice, that I just don't think that we're seeing really publicly, nationally in the way that is needed.
There's the expectation of representation and the void of leadership for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community. You are part of a long history of past failures of leadership. When I started working in the community, I was 19, and this year I'm going to be 50. And I've worked with a spectrum of organizations and institutions. I've had my own organizations. And within myself, I recognize like my failure as a leader. I think that that's because we haven't taken responsibility for mentoring that leadership, passing on power when it's time. We're seeing that on a larger scale too, but there are bigger stakes within our community. So I think our community missing out on those services or not being acknowledged or cared for in different spaces are because people of my age didn't do a good enough job of being in power or having leadership. I think that the basis of Asian American Feminist Collective and the values that you continue to adhere to are really, really important. And you are part of a generation that I think will be a lot more successful at being good leaders. I want to thank you for taking this time and more importantly, for the work that you're doing. Anybody listening who's like me probably would want to offer their help to whatever you need. Keep taking care of each other and yourselves. And I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing. Thank you.
So much, Nancy. This was really lovely conversation.
Yes. And I feel like you are a mentor. I feel like I've heard of so many things through you. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Lots of people have been mentors, but right now you can see sort of a collapse in leadership for institutions that really can make a change for the community. And it happens over and over and over again. It's sort of the same thing that happens, that it's really an ego-based issue, and they don't know when it's important to let go, and they haven't helped to bring somebody else up who can take their place. Sometimes something ends because there was never any continuity built or an understanding that we rely on future generations for something to really like serve a purpose and hold our history.
I feel like I really feel that a lot in the political space because I was working in politics for like 7 years, I would say, as well. I feel like there's such a dearth of mentorship, even with the Asian American leaders and people in politics. There were definitely a handful of people who might try, but I think generally there really isn't. It's kind of a shame, because I know a lot of like really awesome Asian American people who want to do political work. People do have mentors. Like people are like trying to like bring up the next generation of political leaders and like really investing in that. That's hard to find within Asian American political sphere.
There's this person, Nancy Yap. She was part of a spoken word collective at the Writers' Workshop, and now she does political activism on the West Coast. She was also part of the live stream series. She's a good friend. We really wanted to shape the policy component of the conversation. Running for an office doesn't mean running for state assembly or city council, that there are so many smaller roles. Younger people have to be encouraged to go for those smaller roles because that's where very important decisions are being made, and they're positions that are easier to get into and have big impact. If there's any inclination, people should run. In those cases, I feel like there maybe isn't that conversation happening. Younger people need help in how to just take that first step.
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like this is an ongoing conversation, and I look forward to revisiting the Asian American Feminist Collective as you move forward and grow, and what you continue to do.
Thank you so much, Nancy. This was seriously so wonderful.
Have a good rest of the day.
You
Bye.
too. Bye.